Okay, well, Mark did a pretty good job of describing the technology. And so I think you're going to see some overlap of what I'm presenting and what he presented, but I'll try to keep that to a minimum. And this is a similar picture that he showed to start out with. This particular picture is taken in eastern Colorado, but it's pretty representative of views from an airplane in Nebraska or Washington or Kansas. And because maybe this is the closest some of you have ever got to a center pivot, I'll try to explain a little bit more about center pivots and the state of the industry. In the last 20 years, there's been dramatic growth of the center pivot industry, where now we estimate that over 50% of the irrigated land in the United States is with center pivots. And over the last 20 years, that's been growing at about a 1% rate per year. And that's mostly at the sacrifice of flood irrigation. Some of it is new land that's being put into production, because the United States now is about 15% irrigated versus 15 years ago where it was 12%. But most of the growth in center pivot is a replacement of flood irrigation. Now, why did the U.S. convert to center pivots? My company, Valmont Irrigation, introduced the center pivot technology in 1954. And I think we sold 4 machines that year. So at the beginning, it was a very slow growth. And like Mark alluded to, the first center pivots were just to address irrigation in land that could not be flood irrigated. Either the land was too light of soils, or it was hilly and couldn't be flood irrigated. Took too much civil work to convert it to flood. But it's evolved over the last 60 years, where it's probably the lowest cost irrigation on a large scale. And it's also evolved into a very efficient irrigation technique. Now I've spent about the last 20, 30 years of my life introducing this technology in countries around the world. And the first resistance I usually get, the customer says, well, my fields are square or they're rectangle. Circles don't fit in my fields. And the first thing I ask him is, okay, do you have more water or do you have more land? Invariably, he says, well, I got more land. And I say, why are you worried about the corners then? Make it very efficient in the 80% that the circle can cover in a square. Now and I tell him, you know, center pivots are the only technology that is a circle. And that's our strong point with center pivots. And that's for 2 reasons. One is the center pivot goes around in a circle. So it's very forgiving of bad management. No matter how bad a manager you are, the pivot is always in the driest part of the field. The second is the equation you learned in geometry, pi r square. And it's the only technology that takes an exponential advantage on size. That's because with a pivot, you buy the r, which is a radius. So you get an exponential advantage with pi and square. And I think Mark showed a graph that I'd made up there right here. And we've been pressured for 20, 30 years to make small pivots for small farmers. Well, it doesn't work because you're working against that graph. The sweet spot is the 40 to 80 hectares. Fortunately, in the United States, 4 50-hectare pivots fit perfectly in a square mile. But you can see if you get into the 10 and 20 hectare range, it's a very costly form of irrigation, let alone if you're talking 2 or 3 hectares. It's really an impossibility to make a low-cost pivot 2 or 3 hectares. Now, as I mentioned before, lately it's been a very efficient machine, say in the last 20, 30 years, as we developed low-pressure irrigation machines. Now I got two graphs here. One is the amount of water that agriculture uses in the United States. And as you see, it peaked in 1980, even though the amount of irrigation has increased. Now, I don't think there's been any study of the correlation of the adoption of center pivots and the use of water in the United States, but clearly there's a connection there. Actually, it's a good story for the United States. If you'd ask the man on the street, are we using more water in agriculture than we did in 1980? I'd say 99% are saying, yes, we do use more water. Now, at the same time, another good story is the amount of our income that we use for food. You know, less than 2% of the U.S. population are commercial farmers. And only 6% of our disposable income is used for food. It's one of the lowest, if not the lowest, in the world. Now, in contrast to that, in Kenya, 70% of the population are farmers, and 55% of their income is used to buy food. So what does that leave for education, housing, healthcare, let alone in Kenya, the pie is much smaller than in the United States. Now here's another reason to support irrigation. This is the yields that happened in Nebraska corn production in 2011 and 2012. Both 2012 and 2013 were severe drought in Nebraska. Actually, 13 was worse than 12. But I'm just showing you the difference between a rainy season and a dry season in Nebraska corn production. Now in Nebraska, about 50% of all the corn in Nebraska is irrigated. Now look what happened if you were a dryland farmer in Nebraska or if you're an irrigated farm. In 2012, you got a double whammy for your income. You not only got higher prices, you got much higher yields. So it's an insurance policy. Now, in contrast to Africa, 50% of the corn is grown under irrigation. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's 4% of crops are under irrigation. Now, as I mentioned, we first introduced center pivots about 60 years ago in Nebraska. And so North America, which is Canada, Mexico, and the United States, has had about a 30-year head start on the rest of the world with this technology. And it shows in this pie graph that 71% of all the installed pivots around the world are in North America. But our two fastest growing markets are China and Brazil. In fact, South Africa has the second biggest population of pivots next to the United States, but Brazil will probably pass that this year. Now I'm just going to show you a few pictures showing you the versatility of pivots. I was once asked by a government official, surely there's crops you can't grow under pivot. And I said, yes, you're correct. Any crop that can't be grown under rain cannot be grown under a center pivot, which is pretty much true except for the height of a mature crop. This is a picture I took about 25 years ago in South Africa of citrus orchard with a pivot. This is a very innovative farmer, and he sprays the water underneath the canopy here, and he plants his trees in circles, and so he's watering the root zone continuously as it goes around the circle. This is rice. Now 25% of all the irrigation in the world is on rice, and 99% is on flood irrigation. And a pivot can save about 50% of the water that's used on flood. And we're doing quite a few pilot studies in Missouri, Arkansas, and Brazil on pivot irrigated rice. And we found out we can actually save 50% of the water on rice. Now, I was just in Brazil 2 weeks ago. Brazil grows, I think, 38% of all the coffee in the world. And they're by far the lowest cost producer of coffee. And I can see why. This particular farmer here has 21 pivots, 90 hectares each. Can't hardly imagine how much coffee that is. Here's a picture in New Zealand of pasture land. 15 years ago, there were no pivots in New Zealand. But as they converted from lamb production to dairy, they are now the biggest dairy exporter in the world. And the farmers quickly found out that they can raise 3 times more cows on irrigated pasture than they can on dry land pasture. So, with land prices at $10,000 an acre in New Zealand, you don't even have to do the math to say, hey, I'm going to put a pivot on my land rather than buy more land. Here's another illustration showing the importance of irrigated agriculture in the world. Even though only 20% of the land, total land cultivated in the world, is with irrigation, it produces 40% of the tonnage and almost 50% of the value of food. Now we're going to specifically talk about Africa. I mentioned before that South Africa has the second biggest population of center pivots, and that's because they have a very mature commercial agricultural sector. And we started selling pivots in South Africa in the early 70s. And the 3 countries that have really adopted the technology are South Africa, Sudan, and Egypt. Libya also did, but there hasn't been much going on in Libya in the last 3 years. Now, here's a picture I took, I think, 18 years ago. This was the first pivot I sold in Kenya. And this was to a commercial vegetable farmer, an exporter. And he took the chance. I remember he contacted me on the new internet then. That's about a week after I said, we're not going to sell pivots on the internet. But he contacted me on the internet, and I convinced him to try a pivot on these, he called them Asian vegetables, anything you put in a wok. But he would export these every night to London, and he'd harvest every single day. He'd plant every 10 days and harvest every day, and air freight them to London through Nairobi every single night. And he took me up in his airplane and showed me this pivot. And he showed me how he planted every 10 days a part of the pivot. But what I saw was something completely different. I thought, why not have 20 farmers under one pivot, each one growing their own crop, and take advantage of that pi r square equation, which you can't take advantage of now. Now, the problem was Valmont's full of engineers and fabricators. We're not social scientists. The last thing we know how to do is organize farmers. So that idea kind of was left on the shelf for several years until we found some partners that could probably bring something to the party. Now, why are the subsistence farmers growing about 20–25% of the yield that the commercial farmers, or my customers in Africa, and I've been visiting these commercial farmers for 25 years now, and 99% are big farmers, not small farmers, but their yields are 4 to 10 times greater. And that's because of several elements. They have the finance, and they have world-class seeds, and they have world-class inputs, and they engage the value chain. Just like my first farmer in Kenya, selling to Europe every single night. So what do we need? What do we need to engage the small farmers? It's not just giving them a pivot, because that's going to fail. We also have to have an organization that will be on the ground for 2 or 3 years that can, what do I do here? There, I'll get it. There. Okay. So we need an organization that's going to be on the ground and can empower the people and change their mindset from a subsistence to a commercial mindset. We also need financing for these farmer groups or co-ops because they're unbankable. They have no credit, they have no collateral. They need a market access. They need to engage the value chain, and they need the technology. So this is an illustration kind of showing you the different groups that need to work together. And what you have on the upper portion is 2 groups that are grant supported. And that's the human aspect, which is the academic and the NGO aspect. And down below is the market supported, which is the financing institutions, the technology, and the value chain. Now, if you put all 5 of those pieces together and bring those skill sets to the subsistence farmer, you have a very good chance of succeeding. So we have 3 different organizations that are working together on these pilot projects. You have Valmont Irrigation, you have the Doherty Water for Food Institute, the academic side, and you had World Vision, which is a humanitarian organization. Now, what's Valmont's responsibilities? Ours is site selection and turnkey installations and service and support spare parts after the machine's installed. Now, the good thing is that we've been working 30 years for a dealership organization in Africa to support our commercial farmers. So we can easily leverage that organization on these subsistence farmers. World Vision, that's a humanitarian organization that I mentioned. They have another program called ADP, Area Development Program, where they engage the subsistence villages and try to change their mindset to commercial. Now, what they need is the technology to make them commercial. And they also teach them how to save money so they have money left over for the next crop to buy the inputs. Now, Vision Fund is a branch of World Vision, and that's a microfinancing arm, but they've agreed to finance the center pivots and use the center pivots as collateral. And we structured this for the co-op or the village organization to pay back the pivot in 5 years. And what I've seen from the commercial customers is that they can generate about $500,000 worth of income per pivot. And the pivot installation is going to cost about $200,000. So a 5-year payback should put a lot of money in their pocket immediately. Now, the value chain provider. The value chain provider is a large commercial farming structure or buyer that these co-ops can engage, and they'll guarantee a market for their production. What these are is our present customer base in Africa, the large commercial farmers, and they'll serve as outgrowers to these commercial farmers. The Doherty Water for Food Institute, they're coming in to do research institutional support, because the University of Nebraska knows pivot technology very well, and they'll also catalog best practices as we do these 3 pilots. Now we have 3 phases here. We have the pilot stage, the second stage when we engage more of the ADPs that World Vision has, and then by then we should prove the concept and also have best practices to show everyone else. This shows you in Tanzania of all the ADPs that they have. Now we're talking 1 or multiple pivots to each one of these sites. Our first one's up by Kilimanjaro, up in northeast Tanzania. Now this is how we're dividing the pivot up in Tanzania into pies. And we're going to have 8 sections, and we can put a different water application on each one of those 8 sections. And the village will have a production group assigned to each one of those 8 pies. They may be 6 farmers, it may be 10 farmers. It's up to them to assign who's going to be in each production group. Now what's nice is that you can divide a pivot up with roads and also by the wheel tracks of the spans. Every time it goes around, it marks out exactly where the borders are of these sections. This is a picture I took in Rwanda, and we were installing 4 pivots there with the government purchase to have small farmers use. And this little boy was walking by with these oil jugs full of water and walking about 3 kilometers up to the top of that hill to his house instead of going to school. But here, right behind him, was a big irrigation pump. And I thought, what a shame. Why don't we just put a 2-inch poly pipe up to his village and bleed a little bit of water off this irrigation pump, and he doesn't have to walk here every single day. He can go to school. So here's an offshoot of the commercial irrigation pump where we can have livestock supply on one side of the pivot, and we can run water up to the village in an elevated cistern and filter it or treat it for potable water. Now we have 3 pilots we're engaged in right now, 1 in Ghana, 1 in Tanzania, and 1 in Rwanda. And they all differ a little bit, but they all engage those elements I described. The biggest difference is the value chain provider, where in Ghana, it's a large commercial exporter. In Tanzania, it's local supply of fresh vegetables. In Rwanda, it's corn and soybeans for a local operation that makes nutritional food bars. So what makes the concept different? If you look at most of the aid that goes to Africa, it's been to treat symptoms of poverty, not the cause of poverty. This actually treats the cause, which is a lack of income, not the symptoms of poverty. It creates income so they can pay for their own health needs, their own housing, their own education. It's also driven by a consortium of private company, NGO, and academics. Thank you.
Thank you.